Hello, boys and girls of Credit Union Land, and welcome to the season finale of the CUInsight Experience. My name is Randy Smith, and I'm one of the co-founders of CUInsight.com, and it is my job on the show to have conversations with the best and the brightest of the credit union community. It's a little bit different this week. Normally, I get to pick their brains and see if we can't find a few nuggets that we can all learn from. As I just mentioned, it is a little bit different this week. In the season finale, it's kind of a best of, and the tables have been turned. Jill Nowacki, my partner in Human, flips the script on me, and she asks me many of the questions that I've asked our guests this year. This was a ton of fun. I have to admit, I was a bit nervous having to answer the questions, but in the end, she made it painless, and we had a blast doing this. I do want to give a shout out here in the intro to Melina Palmer. I used her maiden name when I mentioned the help and the guidance she gave me in starting this podcast and called her Melina Young. So sorry, Melina. It's Melina Palmer at The Brainy Biz. Check out her podcast. It's amazing. And check out her episode on the show. So without further ado, I give you our season finale of the first season of the CUInsight Experience podcast and Jill's conversation with me. I hope you enjoy.
Randy, welcome to your own show.
Oh, thanks for having me, I guess. That's what everybody says, right?
That's right. That's right. I think in this case, I'm supposed to thank you for giving me the chance to do this, though. I am very excited to have you here and give you the opportunity to share some of your own great leadership nuggets with your listeners to enjoy. Are you ready for this?
I am. You even opened a bottle of champagne to celebrate the first year of the CUInsight Experience. So I thank you, and thank you for doing this. It's going to be fun.
Excellent. Yes, you're over 50 episodes in now, so congratulations for that. And I'm excited to start with a look back at the CUInsight Experience. So it was about 1 year ago this week, actually, that you recorded that first episode with Jim Nussel and open and ready to see what it might become. What was the inspiration for you to start the CUInsight Experience? And does it look today like what you had in mind?
As you know, it does not. So yeah, 50. I just have to say, I want to throw this out there. 50 episodes in, 52 actually this year, and over 50,000 listens, which is mind-boggling. So I have to start by thanking everybody for the support and listening. And we have a lot more good things to come next year. So anyways, yeah, like looking back at the idea, the original inspiration for it was, as you know, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I've had the experience over the past 11 years of CUInsight to meet so many just super smart people. One of the first part of the original inspiration was conversations you and I had at home. And then I remember I wanted the first guest to be Jim Nussel, and it was really going to be more of a video style, like had the whole setup, bought some gear, even all of that type of stuff. And the night before, I decided it was just going to be a podcast. It kind of morphed, I would say, over the first 5 or 10 episodes to really get to that point where I wanted it. But yeah, when Jim walked in, agreed to be on it, he thought he was sitting for a whole video type thing. And it was like, nope, it's a podcast. Let's just go with this. So yeah, it grew, and it's just been more fun than I could ever imagine. So.
Excellent. And obviously something that the industry was really ready to welcome. That 50,000 listens is fantastic. Part of that reason we opened the bottle of champagne. This is definitely worth celebrating. So with this milestone and how far you've come and how the show has evolved, when you look back at it, has there been a favorite guest or moment?
Well, my favorite guest was on episode 4, 18, and 37. You, of course. So, I have to say that my partner in life. That's which is true. But I mean that's to me, like I mentioned, that's where a lot of this came from. Was some of the conversations that you and I would have. I thought it would be a blast to have those with others. Favorite episodes. There were a couple that came to mind thinking about this question, and it was really the ones that were around the direction of it. The first episode with Jim was great. I remember reaching out to him afterwards saying, "You've been on a lot of media. And he took the time and sent me back a whole bunch of tips and things like that were really beneficial. I remember thinking, we were sitting on our couch when the idea for Sam Paxton's episode came up, and it was just that idea of not talking about the upcoming co-op thing, but that audacity to think big and bring this, a decade ago to the credit union industry. And if I remember correctly, I think I Facebook messaged her while we were sitting there and was like, "Will you be on the podcast? This is what I want it to be." And we had the title before we ever recorded that show. Another big one for me early on was Maurice Smith. There was something in that episode when he was talking about his father and the book that he had wrote, and his father asking him what he wanted to be when he grew up when he was 12 or 14 years old. And then him talking about his dad, like quizzing him at night on Keynesian economics and stuff like that. And I remember asking him the question, and it wasn't in the script or anything like that, but it was like, did your dad know this, or was he studying up for it? And the silence, and I happened to be watching Maurice through a Skype interview, and you could just see it was a question he hadn't thought about, but it was such a real moment. And so a few of those things early, I mean, really led to forming the direction of what I wanted this to be. And that was that idea that the CUInsight experience is timeless, not timely in that sense. And it's the leadership and the life hacks and learning from so many amazing people that you and I are lucky enough to get to know, traveling around the country, going to credit union events and all of that. But yeah, I mean, those were just a few early ones, but there were a ton, but there were also mistakes along the way too. I need to apologize again to Steve Swanston, who was on very early, because we were about as far as you and I are in right now, and I realized I hadn't pushed record. And I remember his response was just to laugh and go, but I just killed that answer. So, but he was, it would be tough for me to pick a winner. I think one of our favorite answers probably to both of us is Diana Dykstra's answer of memorable trouble. So if you haven't heard that one, you should go back and listen to episode 16. Yeah. So too many to mention, quite honestly.
Yeah. What a great example, though, of how the organic nature, the changing of it kind of led you to see something else. And by having those engaging conversations with people, you didn't know where it was going to go or what was going to come out of that. How about locations? The flexibility of it being a podcast instead of a video interview gave you some flexibility with your locations, too.
We are recording this again at home in Connecticut, which we did one of the other 3 episodes, but we also recorded in Spain over the summer, in Cadiz, Spain. That had to be a favorite. We were in Key West the first time you were on the podcast, and there were roosters crowing, so that was fun. I mean, when I mentioned Steve Swanson earlier, that was in the Bahamas after talking to John Pembroke on an episode at Q's symposium last year. And then, I've been lucky enough and fortunate enough and grateful enough, quite honestly, to go to Kenya twice this year to work with George and the crew at Akaska. The first podcast I recorded there was with Lois Kitch on paint cans in Kenya. And, then George and Bill Cheney, while in Mombasa, Kenya, Julie Ferguson and I sitting there literally staring at the Indian Ocean, recording on, beach chairs. So there were a lot of cool spaces, and I look forward to many more of those also. So
that's fantastic. You and I have had a lot of conversations about the need to be intentional, really in all areas of life, but specifically in being intentional about diversity with human inclusion. And I've appreciated how you've worked to address this and practice this on the podcast. Why does it matter to you?
It just does, quite honestly. And I will say, there's an interesting part about talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion for me is I've learned so much over the past year from you and the work that you're doing with Humanidei. And even before you started the company, just your passion for that. And it's something that always meant a lot to me, but it was also about giving a platform to have the conversation. And as you said, being intentional. I'm very proud that 52 episodes in, it's 50% men, 50% women. There's, I think we've covered most races, sexual orientation, everything, and it's, I am a traveler, and to me, there's so much that bonds us together, but on the same regard, we have to be intentional and have to change that. And I've learned so much about that from you. And it's something that I plan on continuing to do, is to make sure that not only am I giving people and allowing people to have the platform to talk about things like that are important. And if you want to say having a safe space to talk about it as well, but actively encouraging it and going out and seeking people to have that conversation, because to me, it's just something that I personally believe we all should be having. And I'm going to use your line. We know what the why is, right? Now it's time to start acting on it. And for me, I need to do more than just talk. I have to use this platform that I have as well to do that. So
something I've noticed too about the diversity you have in your guests that you bring on is that you'll get comments afterwards from people, your listeners, who will reach out and say, that was my favorite episode. And you can really tell because each episode resonates with somebody, and you're getting such a broad interest coming back at you too, which is
I am so glad you brought that up. I hadn't thought a lot about that, but you saying it, it brought back so many emails and tweets and things like that where people were, I mean, like you said, they reach out and they're like, by far, this is my favorite episode. And I've had a lot of emails where people are just like, love the podcast, loved this episode. And it was not necessarily the one that just came out that they just listened to, but they had their favorite. So I think that's it's a blast. Keep telling me which one's your favorite. I love it.
Excellent. So you were a novice when you moved into the world of podcasting, but now, a year in, you've got a well listened to, well regarded podcast. What advice would you give to a listener who wants to go out and start their own podcast?
Do it. Oh, now, first of all, that's take the step, decide to do it, go try, learn along the way. There's a few different things that I would recommend. I have to now give a shout out to, Melina Young. A few episodes in, she has her Brainy Biz podcast and, was about a year ahead of, me starting this one. And she took so much time one day to give me so many little hacks that she had learned along the way. So if you're thinking of starting one, I'd say reach out to me or Melina or somebody like that as well. Holly over at Filene, because there is things that you just tend to learn along the way. Another, and I'll put a link to the equipment that we use. It's not that expensive to get going and it doesn't have to be that fancy, quite honestly. So, just getting those, you've seen me buy lots of stuff. I tend to use the same 2 microphones, the same recorder, the same cheap little Skype program that allows you to record stuff if we're not in person. So, and then the other thing that I would say, and that's helped me so much, is listening to other podcasts. I've always been a podcast person who enjoyed listening to them. I now listen to them in a different way. So I'm listening how people ask questions and I'm listening how they transition between questions and segments. And, there've been, whether it's the Tim Ferriss show, one of my favorites, one that I've started listening to recently is by a gentleman by the name of Cal Fussman, who is a 30-year writer for GQ and Esquire and has interviewed some of the most amazing people in the world. He now has a podcast. So to listen to the way that what he takes from a guest and then asks that question back. And then the other big thing that I would say is listen. That's the part for me is realizing that the less I talk and the more other people talk, it's a beautiful podcast. So
this is an uncomfortable one for you then, huh?
This is it. Yeah. I prefer to be on the other side of the desk here. That's for sure.
So there is a question, speaking of your opportunity to listen more than talk, but there's a great question that you've wrapped up the first part of each podcast with, and it's given your listeners really a chance to understand more. But I'd like to ask it of you.
Oh, geez.
So is there something that you think credit unions need to do sooner rather than later in order to stay relevant?
I'm going to give you 2 answers on this. One is from me, something that I truly believe. And then the other, I think, would be almost just coming from the answers to this question over the first year of the CUInsight experience. For me, we have to tell our stories. We are way too modest. And I love seeing it on Instagram, seeing all the good work that the credit unions are doing out in the world. And, whether it was what I've experienced over the past 11 years of CUInsight and the good that credit unions do. And even in the past year, the good that we do on a global level, we have to do a better job of telling that story. So I think that's something we have to brag. We have to put away our Midwestern values or whatever it happens to be. And we need to tell the world the good that we do and brag. From, I would say, across the board, one of the probably the most common answer to this question from all these wonderful thought leaders who've agreed to be on this is that we have to change, be willing to act quick. Digital disruption, the pace of change has changed. And the idea of us sitting back and being a little bit sleepy or taking our time and seeing how things work out, that has to change or we're getting passed by. You've heard me. It's one of my pet peeves is for the last couple of years, if a credit union is putting out, we now have digital banking on Instagram or something like that.
Yeah.
That's table stakes. People already assumed you had that. It's not something to celebrate today. It should have been we see you don't have our digital banking yet, even if it just came out yesterday, right? And that to me is that's using an example of just the pace of change is so quick that as credit unions, we have to be willing to try and, make those attempts quicker. So that's
jump in and do it and learn along the way, right?
And there's that idea of we don't have to get married to the idea also, and it doesn't have to be perfect to the first time we launch it. It's that to me is another beautiful part of this digital world we live in, is that you can go out and you can try something. You can beta test it. It doesn't have to be done or perfect. And then how do you just do you roll it out after that? And I think across the board, when I've asked that question to people, that's been the times are a change, and we got to move with them, and we got to move quick. So.
All right, roll it out, try it. That's a great segue into the next question, which I'll kick off part 2, the leadership and life hacks section. So you and Dave, your partner, Dave Mill, your other partner, started CUInsight over 11 years ago now. What inspired you guys to go out and do that?
Luck. No, the timing was luck, I think. I mean, we were both working in the credit union space at the time, mostly in the Southeast. And David had this idea of a CUInsight that was more of an information exchange, almost like a message board type thing. And in all honesty, if people don't know there's a message board, no one's asking questions around anything. So we had to try to come up with this idea of what would draw people to the site. And it started with looking at aggregating news and information and blogs. And I would always say 11 years ago, to take that step back, we were only, I think it's like 9 months, a year after like the Huffington Post and the Drudge Report started. So media was changing, and we happened to be very lucky. Neither one of us had a background in this whatsoever. So it was, we got very lucky, I think, on our timing part. And then we put a lot of hard work in, and almost like how we just wrapped up the last section, we tried a lot of stuff. And if it didn't work, we scrapped it and tried something new, and slowly pieced together what you see as CUInsight today over the past 11 years. So
it sounds like, just from listening to your talk about the podcast and how many other podcasts you've listened to and how you've changed that over the time, and then your development of CUInsight, as well as that advice for credit unions to kind of get out there and try something new. It sounds like that's been a bit of a key to your success, is seeing some of those leading early things, learning from them, and moving forward. That's really cool.
I've joked to you, I've joked to friends, I've joked to everybody. I don't think of myself as an innovator at all, but I do think of myself as an early adopter, and that's where it's like, let's see if we can do that. And part of the success that I think we've had at CUInsight for both David and I is and this surprises a lot of people when I say it, but we very rarely talk about inside the industry when we're talking about CUInsight. We're looking at like, what's CNN doing? I was having a conversation earlier today with a friend who's redesigning their website, and they're actually, I've talked to 2 people about their websites today, actually, but I was talking to Mike Reuter from the Worldwide Foundation at Woku, and like when we were rebuilding CUInsight, one of the sites I looked a lot at, 5 years ago, was the National Geographic site, and just how visual they were, and how, so, there's like, I've always looked at like, what are people doing outside? And then I remember going to one of our web developers early on, and I was like, I want this like CNN. And he was like, okay, that'll be about $1 million. I'm like, well, we don't have that. What can we get? So, taking a look at what other companies, what other news organizations, what other whoever it happens to be are doing on a national basis, and then how can I bring it down to our, community of credit unions on a smaller basis? And that's something that David and I have always, like, when we're having those conversations, that we've always done. So it's kind of fun.
That's cool. That ability to see something, learn from it, scale it, and run with it is a real gift. It's not something everyone has, which is a good change to our next question there. How do you think that translates to your leadership style? Or I guess maybe how would you describe your leadership style?
Horrible.
Nobody knows what's coming next.
Right. There's a reason that we hired Lauren Culp earlier this year to run the show. I would say myself, I would even think David would probably second this, as we're entrepreneurs at heart. And this, I see a squirrel and that's the direction I go and where my mind goes. So that I think from a leadership standpoint, that can make it very tough to work for on what am I running with next. In a sense of building the company, I think it worked really well. So my leadership style, I would say, is knowing when to get out of the way. It might take me a long time. I might need help knowing that. But knowing when to get out of the way, knowing how to, to bring in people that quite honestly are smarter than me around me and things like that. So I've always said that as a leader, I think I can be motivational just by my energy, and like my vision and goals and things like that. But as a manager, and I'll separate this off, it's a question that a lot of the questions in this section are scratch my own itch questions from, questions that I had at the beginning of the year, the end of last year, when I was looking at the future of CUInsight. And I'm like, how do you do this? Because I seem to suck at it, So, and that's, to me, that's the, I know I'm very good at kind of rah-rahing and putting a vision out there, but then that execution to bring people along, I tend to just put my head down and try to do it myself. And that's not a great leadership tactic. So, yeah.
So in this research that you've done over the course of the year, and as you've talked to the other leaders in our industry, is there something that a common thread or something that was shared among them as far as the trait that made others successful?
One of the things that keeps coming up over and over again is, and it shouldn't be surprising at all, is there are a lot of servant leaders in the credit union space. But one of the traits that kept coming up was listening. Mm-hmm. And it was, across the board, whether it was, Chuck Fagan talking about his time in the credit union, going back to saying, what would the credit union think? And then actually going out and asking credit unions. And I saw that a lot, is that the idea of actually listening as being a trait that seemed to go across a lot of the great leaders that have been on the show, was listening first. So that's something and then the other was the member focus, having that focus on the member, and everything else, going to work itself out if you have that. So, and that's something that I think we've tried to do at CUInsight as well, is take a look at how can we benefit the credit union movement? How can we highlight the smart people in the credit union movement? And from that, the rest just works itself out. We've been, both David and I and the rest of our team have been very fortunate because of this industry. But we've always kind of put how does this help the credit union, not how does this help CUInsight first. And I heard that time and time again from CEOs that have been on this podcast over the past year, was how does this affect the member? How does this affect the credit union? The rest comes, so.
Absolutely. Keeping that end in mind. So speaking of your team at CUInsight, right now, your newest employee is your CEO, and she's great. She's strong, and she's leading a team of people who are solid and have been in place with you for a while there. What's the greatest strength of your team?
The amount of work that they can get done. I mean, the idea that people are always shocked. One of the greatest compliments that I get when I'm out at conferences and stuff like that is this idea that people think CUInsight is a team of 20, 30, 40 people, and we're a team of 5 or 6 people most of the time, so to have, John and Robbie have been with us for a long time, and, you mentioned Lauren coming in, Jenna's on the team, and the others that we get to work with. It's been amazing to watch, not only how well they are able to do their individual jobs, but how well they're able to do multiple jobs and wear multiple hats. I mean, in the end, we are a small business. A job detail, as you've helped us work on when we were doing strategic planning, is very tough to pin down when it's kind of, pivoting to whatever's next. And I've always felt, in having conversations so often with credit unions, it's very similar to a small credit union in that sense, where you're wearing many different hats.
You're the CEO and the teller and the janitor, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You're shoveling the driveway,
right.
the way, so the members can get in when it snows. And that's very much what the team at CUInsight is like too, is I'm sharing something we always say internally, is we like the idea that we're kind of like the ducks who on Instagram and stuff look like we're just, laid back, all of this, but under the water, we're just going nonstop. And my team is, I should say Lauren's team now. She's my boss too. So I'm a cog in that wheel at this point. She is, that team. That's the part to me that blows me away, is how much as a team we can get accomplished day in and day out, quite honestly.
Excellent. So you referenced in your comments a couple of internal things you say at CUInsight, but as a leader, is there something that people have heard you say so many times they can finish your sentence?
I used to say fail fast, fail cheap all the time. And that was for I know that's a line that's been used over and over. And I think it's one of the reasons I stopped saying it. But there was a guy at a CUI's conference years ago, and he was this little, looked like George Costanza. And he was walking on the stage without shoes on. And he said the reason he didn't wear shoes was because he falls off stages. But he was talking about the fail fast, fail cheap thing. And for some reason, I've been to a lot of conferences, but that resonated with me.
I can imagine.
Geez, I don't know what it would be now. I've actually tried to change a lot of that, over the time. I used to say the CUInsight way a lot, and I've tried to, that's been something over the past year. The more I've learned about diversity, equity, and inclusion is, allowing people I want. And I think like Lauren is doing a very good job of allowing and actually encouraging people to bring their whole selves to work. So a lot of the things that I think I may have said in the past may have been mistakes, and I've started to get away from them over
constant
time.
Learning you do.
It is. Learning and growing. Please.
That's beautiful. So when you do think back to earlier in your career, is there a mistake that you made or that you see young leaders? I love your face right now. You're like, I just got done telling you how much I've changed and grown. But something that really stands out as a career mistake, either that you made or that you see young leaders continue to make.
There were so many. A couple of years ago, I was on the Strategic Hotbox podcast with our friend Brandy, and I remember the line that I think she laughed out loud at is, I tend to be the person who touches the stove and then touches it one more time to make sure it's still hot, So yeah, lots of mistakes. But I really would go back to listening. And that's like the one that I'm constantly, I think early on in my career, I felt the need to talk to try to sound smart instead of listening fully before answering. We have a mutual friend in Chip, and one of the things I respect about him greatly, and sometimes for me who talks fast, it can be frustrating, but one of the things that I respect about him is Chip listens to everything you're going to say before he reacts to it. And that's a trait from him that I've really tried to do a better job of. And as you know, I struggle with that still to this day. And I remember, and it was very helpful to me, like when John Spence was on the show, and he talked about repeating things back, a little hack, because both him and I were talking about that we talk too much. But he said, repeating back what the person said before you answer so that you're still paying attention to that. It may sound simple, but it's something that I've struggled with. And I think a lot of people, I've noticed that as I've gotten older, I think a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that they have to, like if they're not talking or if they're not showing how smart they are, then people aren't going to assume they're smart. And that's another thing that I've learned a lot from you over the past few years, is like that idea of, tell me more is a beautiful question that people have probably heard me use on the podcast. And that's something that you say all the time, but it's listening more than talking, right? So
you talk a bit about the mistakes you've made and that there have been many. Are there any real memorable failures that led you to future success, or that one thing that in hindsight you're like, wow, glad that worked out that way?
Absolutely. There would be no CUInsight. I wouldn't have found the love of my life in you if it wasn't for getting passed over for a promotion. There was, prior to getting into credit unions, I was in the financial space still, but I was working for a mutual fund company, and I had moved down to their headquarters in Florida with the hopes of getting back to Michigan, where I was from. And about 6-8 months in, the dream territory opened up, and I applied for the job, and they basically told me I didn't get it because I hadn't been there long enough. But I knew that position wouldn't probably open up for another 5 or 10 years. And it totally, I had to figure out what was next. But I look back on that and say, if I would have had that at that time, I thought it was going to be my dream job. I would have never stumbled into credit unions. I would have never, met you. I would have never, met so many of my great friends that I've met over the past 11 years. I would have never helped start this business with Dave, right? None of this would have existed if it wasn't for not getting that promotion, right? So it's
funny how that works out. Those the things we think have to be just to end up being something that was like, oh, I get it now.
No, I get it. No, I know.
As you've moved through your career, has there been a piece of advice or a life lesson that you keep finding yourself going back to over and over?
It kind of goes back to the listening, but I think it's just been getting clearer over time. Is I had right out of college, I had a sales manager actually who said the greatest answer to a question, because at the time he was talking to a bunch of say 23, 24-year-old kids who were just out of college getting into, a job in Wall Street type thing. And he's like, I remember him saying one of the greatest answers to a question is, I don't know, but I'll find out for you. And his I'll never forget it. He stressed it after the fact, was the idea that, and when you say you'll find out, tell them when, and then you better follow through. And people will always respect that. And I remember at the time being 23, 24 years old, and I'm sitting down with people that are 60 years old talking about their money. And I would go, I don't know. And I had multiple people say, we respect that you didn't just make something up, because that's something that most of the guys that we've sat down with, or most of the people we've sat down with, do. And so that's been something that like has always stuck with me, that I don't know is a great answer, as long as you follow through with figuring it out. So
when you get to that point in your life where you can accept that you don't have to have all the answers, and that it's okay to say, I don't know, that's so freeing, because it opens you up to being able to have conversations with whoever and still be able to be like, oh, like we had a great conversation, and I'll get back to you on the rest of it.
Yeah. And I learned from that. It really does bring me back to another, thing about like, when we talk like about the 25-year-old self or things, but it also shows like how important it is to build the network, right? Like if I would say build your network out of people smarter than you are and that have very diverse backgrounds, because at this point, if somebody asks me a question, I'm texting somebody else to get the answer. Even though I can Google it, I might be able to make a love connection and refer people to each other or do whatever. Yeah. But I mean, that's kind of going down another rabbit hole. But that is something that, like you said, if I would have loved to known that earlier, and it's kind of keeps growing on with that advice that I got early on how important that really is, when you keep following down that path. So
absolutely. So when you run into a wall on something that you're working on, do you have any hacks that are going to get you through that to the other side? Is there something that helps you look at it from a different angle or gain a different perspective?
I feel like I'm copying a lot of people's answers on this, but it's like walk away from it. It's something that I firmly believe is that sometimes just taking a step away, thinking about something else, doing anything else is a good way to look at it. I tend to get inspiration or think of answers at very odd times. So that's, I'd say walk away.
So if you have a free day, nothing on the calendar, and I don't fill your calendar for you, what passions do you have outside of credit unions? And what is it that you do to recharge? How does work-life integration look to you?
Oh, the surprising thing to most people out there about me is I'm actually an introvert who just plays an extrovert on podcasts now. So it's, as you know, for me, I love to create space. I love blank spots on calendars. So it's, for me, how I get away and how I recharge is I go stare at the ocean. As some people that know me, and as you know all too well, I almost measure everything in plane tickets. So do I want to buy something? I'm like, nope, that's a plane ticket to here. So travel is obviously the big one that you and I both share. And it is the time for me that I can turn it off. To me, it's amazing how if I'm staring and smelling the ocean, how my mind, all the other stuff that's normally running the hamster on the wheel just disappears. So travel is a big one for me. I struggle with the balance of it when I'm home. So and a lot of it's been trying to create routines. And when I stick to those routines, I do tend to find that I do better in that type of stuff. But yeah, I think that's always work-life integration is always a struggle especially when I think you love what you're doing. They kind of blend together so much. Obviously, we can talk credit unions all day long. I asked Bill Cheney about this because Chrissy's also so involved in credit unions, but I'm just like, how do you guys turn off credit unions, right? Like, and that's something that you and I have talked about a lot over the past couple of years is like, how do we turn off credit unions? Because we have a lot of other exciting stuff going on too, right?
Yeah. So, it is a little bit of that life by design though. Like we were talking earlier today, even about like, we don't have these jobs that we're like, oh, we do work in order to pay for the rest of life. We love what we do and we love what we're doing when we're away from it too. Yeah.
So, it's a beautiful thing. It's being intentional though, right? I mean, that's something you mentioned that earlier in the podcast. You and I talked about that so often is we intentionally design our life, right? So that's a beautiful thing. All
right. Part 3, the rapid fire questions. The questions are rapid. Your answers don't have to be. Do you remember the first time you got in trouble? Are you going to surprise me with this?
I don't know if I will surprise you or not. I can't beat Diana. I know that.
Thank goodness.
I know Grand Theft Auto in my past. I was trying to think about this. It's so funny, like having to think about the questions that I ask everybody else. The first one that came to mind, there were a couple that came to mind. There have been a few things I've mentioned on the show, but the one that came to mind was my stepbrother John and I being at a pumpkin patch, like when we were probably Crosby's age. So just like 8-10 years old. And next to the cider mill, whatever type of a thing it was, there was a whole stack of pumpkins, and we thought it would be cool to just start smashing them.
Oh no.
Yeah. So, and I just remember my dad came out and like took us both by the arms and threw us in the car, and we had to sit in the car while everybody else had cider and donuts and pick pumpkins and stuff. And I don't think we got to pick pumpkins, but it was obviously you could tell why. We were just
you picked your pumpkins already.
We smashed them. I wonder, we should actually ask him when we see him at Christmas if he had to pay for all the pumpkins. We might have only been 2 or 3 pumpkins in of smashing before we decided.
Don't know if I'm ready to remind your dad of that yet. Yeah. Awesome. Okay, your daily routine. You've shared with your guests that for the last several years, you've tried to journal first thing every morning before you look at your email, your social channels, and all that. So, since you've already shared that if you don't do it, your day feels off, can you tell us more about what it is you do to make sure that stays your top priority?
I make the joke to everybody that I'm a born-again journaler or something like that, because it was something that, to me, changed my life a couple of years ago. And it started with just making a commitment. Like for years, I'd bought journals, and then I'd throw away empty journals because I just never got to them. And a few years back, it was on July 1st, 2 years ago, I was like, I'm going to journal for 30 days straight. And it didn't matter what I wrote. So you and I both read the book, The Artist's Way. There's a great YouTube video that we'll link to that people don't even have to read the book. It's a little short video instead. But it's been great for me because it clears away all the clutter in my head. And I see the difference. Like I can tell you over this past year, it's been a struggle for me where I went back to some of the habits that I had before. But I know the fix, right? Mm-hmm. Where it's instead of looking at podcast analytics and the first thing in the morning, I should be looking at my journal sitting in front of me. The analytics will still be there. And when I'm at my best, I tend not to look at emails until 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning. I take this time to do the stuff that's important. And the journaling allows me to clear my head, and it allows me to be grateful for a lot of things. It also allows me to prioritize things in that sense on what's important, what needs to be done, and quite honestly, what isn't important, because there's a lot of stuff that isn't. So that's the journaling to me. If a perfect morning for me, my routine is journaling and coffee and meditation, and before I get to anything else, and then going from there. And if we're staring at the ocean while we're doing it, it's even better. So
all right, the question that stressed out more guests on the podcast than any other: what is the best album of all time?
It blows my mind that this question stresses people out, because this is like the easiest one to answer for me. And there's no question, and nobody's said it on the podcast, which means that y'all have questionable taste in music. But it's it's Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction. There's not a single song on that album that's bad. People can give me their Beatles White Album, but that is the greatest rock and roll album of all time.
Okay. I'm sure you'll add that to the playlist now.
We will do that.
All right. We're readers. Our stack of books, which is growing beautifully, I might add, thanks to many recommendations from other guests on this show. But what about you? Do you have a book that you've gifted or recommended often over the years?
This was an interesting one for me because there have been a lot. Like I do tend to talk about books that if you ask my team what I say over and over again, they generally tend to know it's from whatever book I'm reading,
right,
at that point in time. So I was thinking about this, like Let My People Go Surfing is probably my favorite business book, and it's by the founder of Patagonia. I mean, it's an amazing book. I think everybody should read it. It made me want to go out and buy more Patagonia stuff, which is completely opposite of what he says in the book, that we shouldn't waste that type of stuff. Outside of like the work sense, I've talked about vagabonding a lot when people reach out to me about my travel, written by Ralph Potts, who also has a podcast now called Deviate with Ralph Potts. So it's a fantastic one. The 4-Hour Work Week is a dated book at this point by Tim Ferriss, but there were things in that changed my life and how I looked at creating balance and like literally designing a life and being intentional, something you and I talk about in creating the life that I wanted. I have books and books and books. We'll link to all of them. But, there was another one, and it's something that I really did want to make sure that I mentioned was there's a book called The Inevitable by Kevin Kelly. I know we've both read that book. He wrote an article years ago called 1,000 True Fans, and that, like, I've been a fan, and it's been something that's directed me since the very early on in CUInsight, is if you create 1,000 true fans, you can do everything. That's just a blog post. We'll link to that, but The Inevitable is a great book too. And like this past year, I've told people about factfulness a lot, and that just shows how the world can be a beautiful place, and little changes can change things over time. So currently I'm reading Creative Calling by Chase Jarvis. So books all over.
Yeah, books all over. First thing you ever sent me as a gift, I think, was a book. That's what drew me in. So yeah. So as you've gotten older, what has become more important to you? Has anything become less important?
Time has become more, much just like everybody else, right? Like everybody
you and 48 other listeners.
Right, yeah, I think it's like 49 out of 50 now or something. So, no, it's for me, it's time and space and balance. I mean, they all kind of work together. That has become much more important. And this is my favorite question that I ask on the podcast. It's staying for 2020 because I absolutely love this. Not only what's become more important, but I love the flip side of what's become less important. And to me, it's, there's a certain beauty when you get to a point of life where you can afford to do the things that you want to do. But there's also like when you start to be able to, so like what's become less important to me is like recognition. Like I live an intentional life for me. It might not be right for everybody else. I was lucky enough to find my human who seems to share similar values and have similar goals there. So, but if other people look at our lives and like, that must be crazy. You don't have, and how to prioritize that and not what's become less important is quite honestly keeping up with the Joneses, right? Like I like our life and I like creating the life that we're living. I really don't care about anymore. Like what's less important is the car that I drive, the size of the house that you live in, the whatever it happens to be. That's become much less important to me over time. And I know, and I'm grateful for, and I know that I'm very fortunate that life has allowed me to get to this point because I've also been in the place where what was the most important to me was having enough money to pay for food or, wondering how I was going to pay for rent. It wasn't that long ago that that was my biggest concern and that was the most important. Now what's most important is like the fulfillment I get from just living in this beautiful world. So
awesome. Okay. So obviously this question isn't out of the blue for you. I forget I have scripted questions to go back to. I can't just have a conversation.
You can.
Cool. This question, not out of the blue for you, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Success. Who's the first person that comes to mind?
So this was an easy one for me, but I have multiple people, but there's one more than anybody else, and it's you. And before this morning, I was going to literally answer it. It's because seeing the passion that you have for what you do. And then this morning, I got to watch you do a happy dance. And just the abundant joy that you were feeling, the smile on your face, the idea, you mentioned it earlier in the podcast, this idea that like to see you this morning with so much fulfillment professionally. And then also we were planning a trip to the Philippines and to have the total balanced life, like it was you and it was that joy and that what lights you up, to use your line that started our whole conversation a couple of years ago. That to me is success. And that's also, you've heard me mention it before, joking around about this question. It's Ted in Roatan, the dive master, right? Who was so excited because he was cataloging sea turtles while he dove. Not for anyone else, just for him. But like the passion he had about the ocean. Scuba Sarah, who went around the world, and we'll link to her Instagram, you should follow her. That I met in the Grand Caymans. But to see some of these people when I spent some time in Bali and Indonesia, that like the passion that they had for the life they were living, that's what I get to experience with you. That's what I saw in you this morning. Those are the people that I look at and I'm like, they've got it figured out. That's success. It's another one of my favorite questions. And the reason why is because we all define success differently. So what's successful to some might not be Ted and Roatan. Right. But to me, I'm like, this guy's got to figure it out, man. He is a happy, you know what?
Awesome. Well, thank you for that answer. But thank you again for creating this show and giving us the chance to learn from all of your guests weekly. And then today for sharing your story and the lessons that you've learned along the way. My last question for you before we wrap up, do you have any final asks of your listeners today or final thoughts you'd like to share?
Keep listening, please, because I'm having a blast creating this, and I love having these conversations. The other thing that I would say is I'm at a lot of credit union conferences, right? Like both of us are out running around. Please come find me. Tell me who you want on the show next. Tell me the guests that you like. Give me feedback, good or bad, on what we can do better, because I am having more fun creating this than I've had in years doing anything. And I want to keep doing it, and I want to keep doing it better for all of you, the listeners, because we have an amazing community of very smart people who have been so open and willing to share their life experiences with the rest of us. So please keep listening so we can do more. And, come find me and tell me what I can do better. That would be that would be it.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to see what 2020 will bring on your show. And of course, you will link to everything we talked about today in the show notes. Is CUInsight on Twitter the best way for people to get a hold of you if they don't track you down at a conference?
Absolutely.
All right.
You can message me there. And thank you for doing this with me. This is so much fun.
Thank you. I loved it. Have an awesome day, everyone.
Enjoy. Before we go, I just wanted to take a quick minute to say thank you to all of you, our listeners. I am beyond grateful for you allowing me to do this and share these conversations with the thought leaders from around our movement. I'd also like to take a minute to thank each and every one of the guests who have been on the show, and Jill for agreeing to be the host for this final show as well. I could not be more excited for what we have coming for season 2. We will be back after the holidays and with some new questions, with a full lineup of guests that I think will blow your mind and also share their nuggets and life lessons with all of us. So without further ado, I will see you in 2020. Enjoy your holidays.